The Ford Indigo arrived at a strange moment in Ford's history. The company wasn't trying to build the next Mustang or the next Halo car. Instead, Ford was preparing for a future that looked nothing like the 1990s. The Indigo was created to test technologies that Ford believed would define the next era of performance. Advanced aerodynamics, carbon fiber structures, and an IndyCar-derived V12 engine that had no reason to exist in a Ford product. And yet, for a brief moment, it represented the most ambitious engineering project the company had attempted in decades. To understand why the Indigo mattered, we need to look at the period right before it. The early 90s had given Ford major wins like the SN95 Mustang and the resurgence of the Taurus SHO, but the company lacked a true technological flagship. GM had the Corvette ZR1, Chrysler had the Viper, and Japan was reshaping expectations with the NSX and Supra. Inside Ford, there was a growing realization. The company needed something that pushed engineering boundaries, even if it would never reach production. This is where the partnership with Reynard Racing began, the same group behind IndyCar chassis known for stiffness, efficiency, and innovation. The Indigo was built around an experimental carbon fiber tub developed with Reynard. Ford wasn't chasing looks first. This was a research platform, shaped entirely by airflow, structural efficiency, and packaging. Nearly every element of the car came directly from open-wheel racing. The suspension used rocker arms and push rods. The aerodynamics borrowed heavily from wind tunnel studies meant for IndyCar programs. The cockpit, low and narrow, wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to place the driver in the exact position needed for ideal weight distribution and control. Then, there was the engine. Ford's engineers created a 6.0-liter V12 using architecture from the Duratec V6. The result was an engine that revved like a race motor but ran with the refinement of a production unit. It produced more than 430 horsepower, but the output wasn't the important part. What mattered was showing that modular, scalable racing technology could be adapted to a road car environment. Ford wanted a platform that could experiment with how far they could push a production-adjacent powertrain without committing to mass manufacturing. The Indigo's public debut was almost surreal. Ford presented it as if it were a preview of future supercars, but internally everyone understood that the car was never going to reach showrooms. It had no doors. No crash structures for consumer use, no realistic production costs. It was, in the most literal sense, a prototype built for learning rather than selling. Yet the impact it had inside Ford was real. Engineers used the Indigo to understand how carbon composites behaved under different stress loads. They used it to refine aerodynamic simulation tools that Ford would rely on years later. And the V12 project helped shape Ford's approach to modular engine strategies in the 2000s, even if no V12 ever reached a showroom. The Indigo's decline wasn't dramatic. It didn't fail. It simply completed its purpose. Once the research data was collected, Ford shifted attention to more realistic projects, the GT90 concept, the next-generation Mustang, and ultimately the early ideas that would become the Ford GT program. Compared to those, the Indigo was too niche and too experimental. The Indigo didn't disappear because it disappointed Ford. It disappeared because Ford had no real place to put it. A carbon fiber Indy-style supercar didn't fit into any market segment, didn't support any future production model, and didn't solve any business problem the company faced in the mid-90s. It was a rolling laboratory, not a product. But even after the prototype was retired, the Indigo's influence lingered inside Ford. Engineers who worked on its suspension later applied the same pushrod concepts in experimental Mustang chassis studies. The aerodynamic team reused what they learned about low-drag underbody airflow in projects that had nothing to do with supercars. Even the way Ford structured its cross-department engineering groups changed because of how well the Indigo program operated. In other words, the car vanished, but the methods stayed. Inside Ford's design studios, the Indigo also became a quiet reference point. Designers remembered how much freedom the project allowed, a rare moment when executives didn't interfere with the creative process. For young designers entering Ford at the time, the Indigo wasn't famous, but it was a myth, a reminder that the company could still take risks when it wanted to. Publicly, though, the Indigo became something else, a curiosity. That myth grew because the Indigo represented something almost unheard of inside a major automaker, a project that existed without a strict commercial purpose. Most designers at Ford were used to working within tight constraints, safety regulations, cost targets, production limitations, market expectations. The Indigo ignored all of that. It was created in a space where the usual rules were suspended, and that gave it a unique status. It became an internal story about what could happen when creativity wasn't filtered through layers of approvals. For many designers, simply seeing the Indigo in person changed their perspective. It wasn't a clay model or a digital render destined to be watered down later. It was a finished, functioning machine, built almost entirely from ideas that would normally never leave the sketchbook. Because the Indigo didn't just break rules, it exposed how many of those rules were optional. Designers who had spent years hearing "that can't be done" or "that wouldn't pass the review board" suddenly had a piece of physical evidence proving the opposite. This wasn't theory. This wasn't a concept written on a whiteboard. This was a machine parked right in front of them, alive, loud, and unapologetic. It forced people to rethink the entire structure of what was considered possible inside a corporation like Ford. And that shift didn't happen gradually. It hit instantly. Junior designers talked about how, after seeing the Indigo, they stopped holding back when presenting sketches. They stopped trimming down ideas to meet imaginary restrictions. They started pushing harder, not because they believed every idea would get approved, but because now they knew there was at least a chance. The Indigo had already proven that somewhere, someone high enough in the chain could give the green light to something this extreme. Engineering teams felt it too. Engineers who were normally stuck optimizing door hinges or adjusting production tolerances suddenly found themselves studying carbon tub construction, Formula One technology, and active aerodynamics. The Indigo became an excuse, a technical invitation, to break out of routine problems and explore things that bordered on motorsport-level innovation. It energized them. It made day-to-day projects feel connected to something bigger. As the years passed, the Indigo became a benchmark for creative ambition. Whenever a new design proposal was criticized for being too bold or too unrealistic, someone inside the studio would point to the Indigo and say, "We've gone further before." It was a reminder that the limits were often self-imposed, not structural. Even as management changed and priorities shifted, that influence lingered. The Indigo was rarely talked about in public, but inside Ford, it functioned like a quiet challenge to every new project. Why not aim higher? Why not experiment? Why not push farther than the competition expects? That mindset began to shape Ford's design culture in subtle ways. Projects that would have been dismissed in the early 90s were suddenly taken seriously. Designers felt more comfortable proposing unconventional ideas. Engineering teams became more open to exploring new materials and structures. The Indigo didn't create that shift alone, but it played a surprising role in accelerating it, and this influence extended beyond the design studio. Across the company, the Indigo became shorthand for possibility. Executives referenced it when encouraging innovation. Engineers used it as proof that cross-department collaboration could work. Even marketing teams cited it internally as an example of bold thinking, even if the car itself never became a marketing product. In the end, the Indigo's greatest impact wasn't the machine itself, but the mindset it left behind. It proved that a company as large and structured as Ford could still break its own patterns, take genuine risks, and build something purely for the sake of advancement. And for the people who worked on it, That realization changed the way they approached every project that followed.